Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And in this video, I wanted to figure out a reasonable workflow for creating this sort of 3D perspective title lettering for games. The underlying format for this is that we're seeing a 2-point perspective, where the letters are tipped away from us and become smaller the further they are. So if we trace out the perspective lines, you can see that the tapering for the front faces of the letters converge to this point up here, whereas the depth of the letters, which run along a different axis, converge to this point down here. So those are the 2 points that make up the 2-point perspective. So I want to try something like this for myself, and for the purpose of this demonstration, I'll be creating a title for a made-up game called Cybercraze, which I've just pulled using one of those online title generators that mashes random words together. I'm using a canvas size of 256 by 224 pixels, which is your sort of 16-bit Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis type of sizing, just to get a feel for how large my title would be on that full screen. Now, given the relationship we just saw with the 2-point perspective, my first instinct here is to create some tapered guidelines that I can build my letters within. So I'm drawing a short line on the top and a longer line on the bottom, and then dividing it into 5 equally spaced slots for the letters. This perspective framework looks appropriate, but I'm quickly realizing here that the problem with starting like this is that I'd still have to carefully adhere to this framework while writing out the letters myself. It really just feels like the grid that I drew out isn't actually helping me as much as I thought it would. So instead, I'm gonna cheat a little bit, and by cheat, I mean use the existing features of the program in their intended way. And I'll start by using the text tool to type out my title. Now I'm working in Photoshop for this, and in Photoshop, the text tool lets you specify the anti-aliasing also. And so you're able to make the text look smoother or stronger, but you can see that it introduces these kind of blurry corners and pixels to everything in order to achieve that. So for this, I'm going to make sure that the AA is set to none. That way it's effectively just a hard brush pixel art look. Now this is still just text, like it's recognized as a font-based lettering and not a standard artwork layer. So I can right click here and rasterize the type, and this means that it'll become just standard pixels on a layer, which means I can manipulate it, like for cutting and moving pieces or painting on this layer directly, anything like that. What I'm using it for though is to change the perspective by pressing Ctrl or Command T to transform, then right clicking and selecting perspective from the available transform commands. If we go to the edge and start bringing in the sides, you can see that it's getting pinched in a way that's playing with that perspective, as if this thing's sort of like a sheet of paper that we're seeing now being tilted back and forward in space. I'm gonna go with something moderate but still noticeable, and I'll settle on a 22.5 degree perspective tilt for this example. You'll notice that just doing this operation has introduced a bit of artifacting. There are all these little missing pixels and jagged edges on the letters now. So as a first pass, I'm going through and filling in these edges to make sure everything's just kind of smoothed over. But more importantly, what I also want to do at this phase is start to customize my lettering and give it some unique features and flair now. So the title Cybercraze actually caught my attention because it sounded like it'd be this dark cyberpunk action game, like maybe you're hunting down a bunch of androids that have gone berserk or something like that. So for the craze letters, I'm making them a bit crazy and threatening, have these like sharper points coming off from the sides. And then for the cyber portion, I'm going to try to make the letters look a bit more rigid in a way that they'd feel more metallic, just to kind of contrast the letters below. Alright, so that's off to a good start for the perspective, but to make the letters actually look 3D now, I'm going to duplicate the layer and drag it down underneath the original. So right now, this duplicate layer just looks like a simple drop shadow. So to actually give it some of that counter perspective, I'm going to shift the individual letters of that drop shadow layer with a slight bias toward the center. So the drop shadow at the center is going to stay directly below the letter, but the ones that are off to the side are going to be kind of pulling toward that center point. Of course, right now this still appears as a sort of drop shadow because it's sort of floating beneath the original lettering. So to complete this logic of these letters actually being solid blocks, I'll use the same color here to connect up the area between the letter and the shadow. And hopefully you can see how these connections are making it look more like a solid form now. The next step then is to get this colored and rendered up, which sort of feels like just like the rest of the owl, a lot of involved steps or whatever. But at this point, it's actually just a few coats of paint on top of what we've already got here. I've swapped around some of the tones here and placed it on a dark background. And I was thinking of doing the word cyber in blue and then craze in this reddy pink tone. And for both of these, I want them to have a stripy arcade style gradient to the coloring. Kind of like we see in Super Metroid here with the steps from red to yellow. I was just about to work out some manual steps of color and brightness, and then I remembered that there's actually the Super Color Palette Generator tool that I found out about recently. Now, I featured this in another video recently, but basically what you do here is choose a starting color and then use the sliders to tell it how much to increment things like the hue and the saturation for each subsequent step away from that color. So in this case, I've set it up to take that blue and step it toward green while also making it brighter and less saturated with each step. I've used this same relationship for the reddy pink tones, and then I kind of color pick these into a small palette for myself here. I'll use the magic wand tool to select the front faces of the letters, and then increase my pencil size and just sort of brush each step of color over those selections, starting with the darkest color on the bottom and then working my way toward the brightest along the top. I suppose you could always experiment with, different layouts for the gradient here, but for some reason I always think of this particular arrangement as being like the classic appearance. It might be that the lighter tops of the letters also get your attention easier for reading, I'm not quite sure. Either way, you can see here the effects looking pretty nice. And I've actually taken this a step further by adding just a couple rows of checkerboard dithering to help transition the color steps. I feel like this is one of those things, like when you're viewing it from a distance, or especially with a bit of blurring from a CRT, you can really feel that it's sort of a softer gradient, rather than if it were this like sharp change from one color to the next. From here, I'm trying to reuse colors from the palette and just add a few different effects, like sort of putting this edge highlight along the letters and trying to make them pop a little bit more. One of the things I found pretty fun about this exercise is that since this was kind of a random title anyway, I don't really feel any particular restraint in terms of how this has to come out. So I'm just going to throw a few more little finishing touches just for the sake of experimentation. In fact, I think it'd be really fun to give this game a subtitle also, as if it's already kind of a sequel in an established franchise. And so once again, pulling from that randomization site, another bit of phrasing that I liked from there was this title, Metal Abyss. So I'm going to title this game now the overly titled Cyber Craze Metal Abyss. And I don't know why, but in my headcanon, just like seeing all the titles put together, I just have this image that this game was notoriously difficult and glitchy, and it's got this like weird reputation about it, where it'd be like, yeah, dude, the first 3 Cyber Craze games are classics, but once they got to Metal Abyss, that's where the franchise really started to go downhill. But regardless of whatever happened with the franchise, we only really need to focus on like the engineering of the title at least. So let's go take a look at the finalized logo for Cyber Craze Metal Abyss. Here we go. Alright, one of the last things I added here were these little floaty bits around the lettering, which I was thinking of being sort of like embers that are kind of swirling around. I hope this workflow helped inspire some ideas about making title lettering. As I said, I was just kind of experimenting for myself here, so feel free to drop any workflow tips you might have. And let me know if you think the Cyber Craze franchise really did start to go downhill at Metal Abyss, or do you think the game was simply misunderstood at the time and deserves another chance in this day and age? We'll close out with some CRT time to see how those letter effects look. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.